All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program, Planting with Pollinators. So I know many of you have been to my programs before, but for those of you who are new, my name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator with Clay and Owen counties. I'm also an entomologist. So what I do is I do and have done a lot of research with bugs, primarily in insect ecology and habitat selection and things like that. So I approach this particular topic from the point of view of what an insect looks for. So I'm going to talk a decent amount about the things that insects in particular are going to look for and how our different plants have evolved to accommodate the insects or just plain take advantage of them. I'm also going to talk about a few different ideal pollinator groups that I think that you would benefit from going ahead and trying to encourage growing on your properties or in your areas, because these are ones that I personally know are very successful, are relatively easy to manage in the scope of things, and can be obtained fairly quickly within the state of Indiana. So if you are coming from outside the state of Indiana, some of this may be a little different to you. And if you have questions about areas where you are located in, please feel free to message me after the program and I can look at that a little bit more closely with you. Let's go ahead and see what we have here. So I kind of said this already. Insects and plants have a unique cycle of life with each other. Over the course of their existence, insects and plants have adapted to the presence of one another. And sometimes in some very, very fascinating ways. I would love to do an entire program that talks about the coevolution of insects and insect host plants. But what it means when we're talking about our pollinators is that these two groups of organisms have very, very specific adaptations that can be applied to individual plants. And we're going to talk about some of those in broader strokes. There are a lot of them that can get very, very fine down to the nitty gritty details, but I'm afraid it just some of that may not be interesting to you, or it may take a little bit too long to explain. But let's see what we can talk about this evening. So primarily, I want to focus on those aspects of plant adaptations that are the plant adaptations, basically. They're the ones the plants themselves have developed. There will be several that insects have developed as well. And I will probably cover those more. And we have covered some of them already in different programs, like when we were talking about bees a few weeks ago and things like that. And as we go on a little bit further down the line, we're going to talk more about some garden insects and we'll cover them there. But for plants right now, let's take a look at what they do and how they do things. So plants, I've kind of grouped them into three different concepts here, but there's probably quite a bit more that we could talk about. So the first one that I'm covering here are structures that are intended to increase or force insects to get pollen. These are ways that plants have specifically shaped themselves to increase their chances of pollen brushing off onto insects, or in some cases, they deliberately force an insect down a path that gets them covered in pollen or plant attachments that are covered in pollen. Plants have also altered the colors of their various structures, so that way they are much more easily detected by pollinator species. Insects generally have very poor vision, but they do see different colors than we humans do. And plants have begun or have taken advantage of that over the course of several million years. And then plants also have figured out how to secrete different odors that are meant to signal pollinators. And we usually refer to those as pheromones. What pheromones are chemical signals released by one organism intended to send a message to another organism. Usually that happens between insects or animals that are part of the same group. But in this case, plants have adapted to be able to message their pollinators, the ones they rely on the most. So let's talk a little bit about how insects are going to access pollen. Let's talk a little bit about what pollen is first going to mean to an insect too. So we see our pollinators as just animals that are getting covered in pollen just by brushing by plants, or they're attempting to get nectar so the pollen gets on them in that process. But that's not the only thing going on there. Insects need pollen. So nectar is simply a carbohydrate to them. It's sugar, essentially. It gives them energy to fly, to be able to forage. but it's not going to help them grow. It's not going to help them create eggs. It's not going to let their young develop. Pollen, however, does do that. There are several proteins in pollens that insects have adapted to use as a part of their life cycle. So many of them are getting just as much advantage out of that. Now, there are insects out there who are only going after nectar. Primarily, that's going to be our butterflies and moths doing that. And there are several who are going to be going after both. So it is going to vary a little bit across the spectrum of all the insects out there. But the plant needs to be able to make sure that it can spread that pollen, that the insect will have access to it. And just so I can make sure we cover this ground, just in case people don't fully understand the relationship of plants and pollen. So plants need to reproduce just like anything else. They need to create seeds. And the way they create those seeds is by making sure pollen accesses the female portion of a flower where the ovaries are located. So the pollen carries the male gametes or the male reproductive information of a flowering plant. That pollen needs to be spread either to different flowers or to flowers of a different sex. So they take advantage of pollinators to be able to do that for them. Some plants are wind pollinated, though we're not really talking about those here. So what we do, or what these plants do rather, is that they want to guarantee or at least enhance their chances of a visit by an insect. So what they do is they try to create a place where insects can safely land. They'll structure their flowers to provide a landing space. And if we look back at that previous image, we can see, there we go. We can see that those landing pads are very, very obvious. These asters clearly have this nice flat area where all of their anthers, the organs that carry the pollen, are arranged very neatly, where the insect, to be able to access the nectar, has to push past all of them. The nectar well of these asters are below all the yellow anthers that are pollen covered that you see here. And then insects who just simply want to also get the pollen have very, very easy access to it. It's right there. They can reach their mouth parts in and grab it. Now, some flowers, however, don't necessarily use this particular path. You can see that in that last bullet point down there. I say some have created a tunnel into the flower that kind of gets the insect covered in pollen. And there are plenty of trumpet-like flowers that we can see on lots of different plants. Orchids are a very, very kind of notorious plant when it comes to this particular activity. So before we dive into that portion of it, though, here's just some different structures of anthers and how they work. And I really, really like this image because it's showing something unique. So the small kind of spike-like yellow structures are the anthers of the flower that have the pollen. And then the green, odd kind of three-pronged organ is the pistil. That is the spot where the pollen enters and begins to burrow down to get access to the ovaries and what will eventually become the seeds. You could see that the way that is pronged and kind of spreading outwards, that it's intended that the insect brush by the pollen and immediately come into contact with the pistil, so that way pollen is just spread right into the ovaries of that flower very, very easily. The insect has lots of room to maneuver to make that happen. So the flower is basically hedging its bets to guarantee that the surface area is going to be there, the capacity is going to be there for that pollen to move, and not put any undue stress on the insect. However, other flowers are going to take a little bit of a different path. So I was actually asking a group of school kids this the other day when I was teaching them about pollinators. And I asked them, what shape do you think that flower looks like? And at first, they just weren't really sure. They couldn't give me an answer. And then one of them looked and said, well, that kind of looks like a wasp, or that kind of looks like a moth. Well, they were right. A lot of these flowers, when viewed at the right angle by an insect, they're going to look at them and go, that looks like an insect. And that is very, very intentional. In the case of these orchids right here, what they're trying to do is they are trying to pretend to be another insect. So that way it believes that it is finding a potential mate. And then where the pollen is if you look at the center flower right here, and I'm going to try to see if I can't annotate. Well, I guess hopefully you could see me hovering near it. What it's doing there is that it's creating this tunnel where the insect is going to go in there. the orchid may be producing different scents, it may be doing different things, and the insect is going to go in to try to look for food or something else, and the pollen will it'll begin to cover its body. Sometimes when it comes to especially orchids, what they'll do is the insect will enter down that tunnel, and there'll be a kind of a pollen basket attached to the flower itself. And when the insect moves past it, it will disengage from the flower and attach to the insect. This relationship has become so concrete between different insects and flowers that if we look at the body shape of certain native bees and wasps, we'll actually find that their back has a little notch in it where it will intentionally brush by the flower, by that detachable pollen basket, and kind of grab onto it almost like Velcro, and they'll carry it off with them. So that's how closely they've adapted to each other and how much they've come to accommodate the needs of each other, because the flowers can't reproduce without the insects, and the insects can't reproduce and feed without the benefit of the flowers. So let's go over a little bit about our color now. This is one of the more fascinating aspects of this that I like, and I apologize for the quality of this picture. This one was taken by a lab, I think, in North Carolina, though I don't remember specifically now. I've gone over it so many times. And what they did is they took a picture of these flowers, and then they also took a UV image of these flowers. And then what they did is they colored it in so we could actually perceive the difference, because you and I, our human eyes, we can't see ultraviolet light. So we need to color those so that way we can tell the difference between them. And the idea is as we look at these flowers, we are going to see that difference. We're going to see that there's a landing pad there that the insect can see. That difference in color there is a giant Eat It Joe's sign that all these flowers are putting out. Now, like I said, insects generally have very poor vision. Their eyes are covered in what's referred to as chitin. That's the same material that their bodies are made of, their exoskeletons. It's called chitin. It's a very, very tough, very durable material. But their eyes are made of it. Their eyes are covered in it. And as you can imagine, their eyes probably get a little scratched up as they just live their lives. They fly, they go through plants. So imagine that you're permanently looking through a pair of sunglasses that are kind of dark and they're kind of scratched up all the time. Now, insects can see into the ultraviolet range, and this is going to be very typical in all of our pollinators. So they're picking up that extra bit of light. Now, the color is going to indicate those optimal locations that the insect wants to find, but they need help. So for example, if we use this image right here, the top image is what you and I would see if we were looking through faceted eyes. Our brains can figure out abstract shapes. We can tell bits of information from just small parts of information. We can figure out that one of those is a circle, one of those is a square. But the insect brain and its eyes are not capable of that level of complexity. So the difference between the circle and the square is essentially non-existent to them, as you can see in that bottom half of that picture. So their world is a lot different than ours. If I go over to this image right here, this looks like a giant mess of color. But if you look at it for a moment, you could probably come to the conclusion that we're looking at probably some daisies or maybe more asters. There might be roses in there too, some possibly yellow flowers or leaves. Our brains can figure that out. The insect cannot figure that out, though. So they need additional help. Now, one fascinating thing is that National Geographic actually looked at this a little more closely. They started taking pictures of different flowers and began coloring them so we could better see the UV difference, where if we could perceive ultraviolet light, maybe we would begin to pick up on this. And you can really see a lot of this just jumps right out to you because of those different colors, because insect eyes are meant to be able to perceive these things, and plants have adapted to accommodate that fact. And some of these images are just absolutely incredible. But we do need to keep in mind, this isn't literally what the insect is seeing. This is just a frame of reference so we can understand those differences. We can't imagine what the insects see. We don't have an idea what ultraviolet light looks like. We can only guess a little bit. So the last thing that plants do that I wanted to go over, and there's more to this obviously, but these are the simple ones I wanted to cover this evening, is the secretion of odors, different scents that all of our plants put out. There is a lot of variety in here. So flowers are going to intentionally create those floral scents the reason they smell so nice. That's very intentional. That helps bring in pollinators. Insect and other larger animals are going to be attracted to those smells. Even we are attracted by them. We like floral scents. Floral scents are the basis for most of the smells that we like. Some of these plants are going to use those scents to signal directly, hey, I have food, while others, like in the case of our orchids, may imitate the scent of a potential mate, and they're going to take advantage of that. Now, here's the thing, though. The presence of an attractive odor does not necessarily correlate to the presence of a reward, meaning that even though the plant smells great and the insect wants to go to it, there may be no nectar well in the plant. There may be nothing there that the insect will actually benefit from. All the plant is doing is it's fooling the insect and just enough to get them to come and fly over and get pollen from them. So right now we're looking at a few different things that are going to create a lot of different scents. This is, I believe, a plum tree, and it's going to have a really nice floral scent where there is food available to the insect, and it's going to fly right up to them. It's going to be able to get a nice meal out of it. Whereas here is our spider orchid. This is perhaps one of the most infamous offenders in this area because the spider orchid pretends to be a female insect ready to mate, and it smells like one. The trouble is there is no food in there whatsoever for that insect. There is no reward cycle involved. So it is using a conning strategy, basically. And then last one I'm going to show you, this is one that probably only a few of you have seen before, corpse flower. This one is an interesting example because what it does is it creates a scent similar to that of a decomposing organism. It will smell awful. If any of you are specialist flower growers, you may be more familiar with this. I find them fascinating, but I like some of the weirder plants and weirder flowers because I study insects. This thing smells awful, but it brings in pollinators who are directly attracted to those scents. But in this case, those pollinators are intending probably to find decomposing material to consume and bring back to their young. Now, they could feasibly find a nectar well that is going to create a reward cycle there, but it may not necessarily be their primary food source. Regardless, though, the flower's adaptation has been great. It works very well. And if you ever get the chance to go to a garden with like strange plants or something like that, you'll probably find a corpse flower. And I highly recommend you get that experience sometime. So the big thing is I have talked your ear off about how insects are going to find flowers. Now let's talk about a few flowers or plants that I think you're going to benefit from. Now, what I'm going to do is everyone who's registered for this program, I'm going to send all of you a recording. And for those of you, some of you are watching it right now, you should have also received from me a publication about pollinators that is going to have a very large list of pollinating plants that you can use here in Indiana. So make sure you look for that in the email that you received to get this recording or the one that you're about to receive. Everything I'm talking about right now is also on that list. All right, so some things that we need to keep in mind. Planting for pollinators does not and probably won't ever match up with a perfect landscape. You are not, if you decide to start planting for pollinators, you are saying that landscaping may not be the most important thing to you because our yards are going to benefit from going a little bit wild if we want to attract pollinators and if we want to provide them habitat where they can survive. Because folks, our pollinators are definitely in a lot of danger right now. Human activity has removed a lot of their landscape. A lot of our local populations have been extirpated. Local populations have essentially gone extinct in some places, and they need to be brought back more. And pollinators need diversity. They need lots of different species of plants to be able to have a diverse enough forage to be able to survive. So tonight, what I'm hoping is that you're going to learn a little bit more about what you can do to try to help create that kind of landscape for them. So first off, make sure your chosen species not only attract pollinators, but also feed them. Yeah, the orchids are great and they'll get pollinators there, but like I've been telling you, they may not necessarily feed them very well or at all. You want to make sure that you are thinking about all the pollinators you're going to attract. I say insects here, what I should have said was bees. So remember, bees aren't the only pollinators out there. There are several kinds, including beetles, And different butterflies, moths, even bats and other animals can be pollinators in the right circumstances. And check to see if the plants that you choose can reseed or if they have a high maintenance requirement. Because ideally, what you want to do is you want to start a nice situation where you can plant stuff. You just need to monitor it a little bit and it'll generally take care of itself. That's why tonight I'm going to talk about native plants, because those should be able to take care of themselves, or at least have the better chance of you just needing to monitor them a little bit. So first off, I know I'm not going to make any friends with this one. Clover is an excellent choice of plants for pollinators. And a lot of our yards are already going to be capable of supporting clover. And dandelions are great for pollinators. They are a wonderful native plant that's going to provide an excellent amount of food for pollinators. The trouble is I doubt a lot of you are really going to be willing to not mow for a while to allow those flowers to exist. Right now, we don't have to mow because it's ungodly hot, and I'm sure none of you want to go outside right now to try to do this. But if you let your yard go a little bit wild, you're actually going to provide them habitat. Now, here's the thing. Depending on your volunteer populations, you may not need to put in much input to be able to start this. A lot of us already have dandelions and clover that'll grow in our yards very readily. And if you don't mow super low, you're going to be able to keep these plants in your yard. And you could still do regular mowing and keep them growing, and they'll reflower and they'll keep coming back. So these are really, really ideal times where you could take advantage of what are typically thought of as weeds. A lot of them, the clover particularly, are going to provide you a benefit because clover are going to fix nitrogen and put it back in your yard. So it's going to help keep your yard fertile. And both of these are capable of surviving in extremely poor soils. So this is kind of your ideal couple of plants right here. They can survive in just about any environment. They need minimal input, and you could still do a certain level of lawn manicuring and maintenance, and you're going to get a benefit out of them. The trouble is that when we see clover and dandelions, we usually think, oh, the weeds are coming in, or the clover's up, I need to mow my yard again. So asters. Asters are one of my favorite pollinator plants. I think asters are gorgeous. So asters are going to be, this depends also on the genus of aster that we're talking about. They're going to be late summer to fall blooming plants. There are going to be several species that are going to be very good pollinator forage, and that includes our New England and swamp asters, both of which are going to grow very easily here in Indiana. They're also going to be full sun plants, but they will need some soil moisture. So if you have very dry soil, asters may not be very successful. Now they're going to get a little bit tall. They'll get between 3 and 5 feet, depending on how much you allow them to grow. But they will be able to survive if they have the right environmental conditions. They will be fairly resilient. I have a couple of asters planted that I recently planted in my front yard, and I was worried they were going to get pretty badly shocked when the temperature changes started going. And they're still alive. They're still going. So they're able to survive. Now, just so you know what we're looking at here, we've got our swamp aster. This is a fairly common one. It does need a little bit of wet soil to be able to thrive. And then our New England aster. They don't look a whole lot different, but they are different species. Asters also represent one of those plants that has a nice landing pad arrangement for our insects. So if I showed a UV lamp over these, you would begin to see patterns form in the flowers that kind of look like a landing pad. So another one that is going to be very popular to plant for a lot of our pollinators will be anything that belongs to genus Asclepius. And some of you may recognize this as our milkweeds. These are summer blooming plants. They're going to be mainly known for their role as hosts for monarch butterflies, though those are not the only species that will stop by. They are just very supportive of monarchs. So that's going to include species like the butterfly weed that you were just looking at, as well as common milkweed, marsh milkweed, and several others. If any of you were at the Monarch program that I and Tabby Flynn did, she talked quite a bit about these, and you're going to find more information on them on the publication that I'm going to send out to all of you. Now, asters are going to require full sun, or I'm sorry, not asters, milkweed are going to require full sun, and they will need kind of somewhat drier soils, or at least well-drained soils. The trouble is a lot of people will consider these weeds. So it's going to be very important that you identify them to make sure that you're not just taking away something that you'd benefit from, especially helping out our monarchs whose food supplies are going to become very, very crunched as our climate keeps shifting towards higher temperatures. So just to give you an idea what some of these look like, this is butterfly weed that's very commonly available in a lot of farm stores, garden stores. I actually bought some butterfly weed recently at a Rural King near me, and they will generally be very, very successful. The thing is that butterfly weed will spread, so you will have to monitor, keep it clipped back a little bit just in case. Swamp or marsh milkweed is a plant that's generally very easily successful, but like it says, it's a swamp or a marsh milkweed, which means it does need some moisture in the soil to be able to be successful. And then common milkweed, which is one that you can very readily get from organizations like Monarch Watch, and just local master gardeners probably keep it on hand as well. And these are very easy to plant and keep surviving. So our last group of flowers that is going to cover this evening are our coneflowers. A lot of us grow coneflowers all over the place. I like coneflowers too because they reseed so easily and they just come back year after year. So this is one of our more useful flowers in that there are going to be differences in genus again here. Some are going to be good as spring and summer bloomers, whereas others are going to be summer and early fall. So this is split between the two major genuses that we're talking about, Echinacea and Ratiba, or Ratibida, sorry. So Echinacea are going to be our earlier in the season ones, our spring and summer bloomers. And the other one, Ratibida, is going to be our summer and fall bloomers. Now, these do need full sun, and they also need well-drained soil, but they are very, very drought resistant. We've had these in front of one of my offices that I work in that is a very well-drained area, and it can go through a whole drought, and these things will still keep going. The other benefit behind these is that they are perennial. They will keep coming back year after year. So here's just a couple of flowers that are really nice to work with. Purple coneflowers are perhaps my favorite ones. We still have these coming back year after year. They're gorgeous. They're kind of neat to look at. I like them too because they make a great teaching aid when I'm teaching children about different pollinators and things. And these are very, very readily available at a lot of stores and a lot of seed mixes that you may find. So I love purple coneflowers. So the last things I was going to talk about tonight is that we have pollinator-friendly plants that aren't flowers too. There are several species of trees and shrubs that you can get that will help provide substrate for pollinators to find food. One of them is going to be our maple species. So a lot of us are very, very familiar with maples. In this case, we're talking about our red maple and our sugar maples, so Acer rubrum and Acer saccharum. Maples are generally fairly easy to take care of, but our sugar maples are particularly susceptible to some diseases. So they do need full sun with well-drained soil, and they're going to bloom in the spring, normally with some nice yellow flowers. Naturally, that's when my allergies start acting up the worst. But the biggest problem is, like I said, there is some disease susceptibility in sugar maples. They can get leaf canker and some other problems that may not necessarily kill the maple, but it will definitely make it look kind of awful if it gets the disease. And I imagine some of you have already been working with this already. And then one more plant I was going to cover is our spice bush. Spice bush can be a great plant for pollinators. It is a shrub, and it will do some flowering and have berries as well. So this is one of our partial shade plants that needs a well-drained bit of soil to grow on. This shrub will spread through root sprouting, so it doesn't necessarily need to seed to be successful as long as you can get the whole plant and plant it. It's going to bloom with nice yellow flowers in the spring, which may have different color morphs, so yellow may not always be the thing. And then eventually it's going to produce those nice bright red berries that are probably going to attract birds over too. Now they can get a bit big, it's 6 to 12 feet, so you may want to keep an eye on their size, and you want to make sure you don't confuse them with other plants. You want to look for the species Lindera benzoin. That is the spice bush. There are a few that can be confused for them, so keep an eye out for that species. And I see Patty, she's also saying there, She has milkweeds that she can give away for free, and she also has buttonbush that she can give away for free, and that's going to be something that's going to be very common with a lot of our master gardeners. So please feel free to look them up in your individual areas and see what they have available. If nothing else, they can point you in the right direction. And we just have the benefit of Patty to help us out here in Vigo County. All right, so that is what I had for this evening. I've got my contact information up here, as well as some links to our Purdue Ed Store and our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. One thing I will say is our temperature and our humidity is ridiculously high right now. So that means our risk of disease in plants is also high. So monitor your plants until we get to July, until we get to that dry down. There is going to be some increased risk of problems there. And I wanted to share this QR code with you. So what this will do is you could scan this right on your screen with your phone, and it'll take you to a website where you could fill out a survey and let me know how we did, and if you have any thoughts on other places we can go with our programs. All right, and with that, I will be more than happy to take all of your questions.